Hi and welcome to Mrs. Long's video lesson on the Picture of Dorian Gray. Today we're looking at chapter 11. So chapter 11 picks up quite a few years after the end of chapter 10. Much has gone on in Dorian's life in the intermediary time between this chapter and the previous chapter. And we see evidence of that in the decay of the portrait that is described and in the description of rumors of Dorian's life and reputation. And it also describes his growing obsession with the book and also the sorts of things he's been occupying himself with in the years between that's not covered specifically in the book. Okay. So the end of chapter 10, it dealt with Dorian saying to Lord Henry that he's fascinated by the book, but that doesn't mean he likes it. And Lord Henry says, "Oh, you know the difference now," which kind of suggests that it might also be Lord Henry sort of hinting at his fascination with Dorian and sort of hinting at Dorian's morbid fascination with this book. Now, it says he can't free himself from the influence. Or perhaps it would be accurate to say he never sought to free himself. He procured from Paris no less than 9 large paper copies of the first edition and had them bound in different colors. And he has them bound in different colors to suit his different moods, depending on how he's feeling when he wants to read it again. So this young Parisian, the hero of this book, becomes almost like a symbol of himself to Dorian. And he says he seems as if the whole story contained his own life written before he'd lived it. So we can see he's definitely grown an obsession with this book and the story. And he himself recognizes that it's a poisonous book. Okay. So you can look at the book as having a major influence on Dorian, Lord Henry, and of course he's the one who gave him the book, and that was not by accident. And of course Dorian just giving into his carnal innermost desires as a result of realizing that he can indulge in these without experiencing the external effects of it. So this description here is describing the cruel joy that he used to read the latter part of the book, which is tragic, if somewhat overemphasized account of the sorrow and despair of one who had himself lost what in others in the world he had most dearly valued. So he takes a sort of sick pleasure in reading the end of this book, and it's almost the kind of sick pleasure he takes in observing the painting as well. For the wonderful beauty that had fascinated Basil and many others seemed never to leave him, even those who had heard the most evil things against him. Even the strange rumors that people heard, they couldn't believe anything to dishonor when they saw him. He always had the look of one who'd kept himself unspotted from the world. They wondered how one so charming and graceful could have escaped the stain of an age that was as once sordid and sensual. So, sorry for that Freudian slip there. So, what this is dealing with here is this idea of appearance versus reality, and also how superficial the people in Dorian society are in thinking, well, if he looks beautiful and innocent, then he must be those things. And then not being able to believe the rumors about him because he seems to be so pure and young and beautiful looking, which of course is a complete fallacy. Like you can, be up to all sorts of horrible things behind the scenes and still look innocent on the surface. And the fact that people have the inability to separate the two and realize that he could still be doing these horrible things shows us the sort of superficiality of their society. So this describes now this kind of cruel joy, this sick pleasure he takes in creeping upstairs to the locked room opening it because he's the only one with the key, and then standing with a mirror in front of the portrait and comparing the fair young face that laughed back at him from the polished glass to this terrible, monstrous thing. It's described as having hideous lines, the seared forehead, the heavy, sensual mouth. He would place his white hands beside the coarse, bloated hands of the picture and smile. He mocked the misshapen body and failing limbs. You can imagine his sense of triumph over nature, standing looking at this hideous aging portrait with all of the visible signs of sin and a life of pleasure, and then looking at his own unstained reflection and just, congratulating himself on having escaped all of that. However, the portrait, all of the benefit it affords Dorian, it doesn't leave him unscathed in terms of his mental stability. And it describes here how in moments at night, when lying sleepless in his own delicately scented chamber, or in some sordid room of an ill-famed tavern, referencing to his reputation, where he was under an assumed name and a disguise, he would think of the ruin he'd brought upon his soul with a pity that was more poignant because it was selfish. And so he isn't unaware of what he's done to his own soul. And what also manifests for Dorian is his complete paranoia that someone is going to discover the painting, which also brings him a sense of unease. Another sort of aspect, sort of the reason that people found chapter 11 to be so onerous to read is because of all the long descriptions about the things in which Dorian involved himself. So he became quite sort of circumspect, and it's describes here as he looked back upon man moving through history, he was haunted by a feeling of loss. So much had been surrendered and to such little purpose. There had been mad, willful rejections, monstrous forms of self-torture and denial, whose origin was fear and whose result was a degradation infinitely more terrible than that fancied degradation from which, in their ignorance, he had sought to escape. So he looks back at everything that man had given up in the fear of the consequences, and this kind of confirmed to him that his way of living, as Lord Henry had prophesied, was as a new hedonism, was to save himself from having a life of Puritanism and a life of denial instead of a life of just purely pleasure. So he explores Catholicism, Darwinism, and but it says that he never fell into the error of arresting his intellectual development by any form of acceptance of a creed or system. Now you can imagine how Dorian's beliefs and his behavior would clash with the ideals of a system, particularly one of Catholicism. Yet, as has been said of him before, no theory of life seemed to him to be of any importance compared with life itself. So again, we go back to this idea of hedonistic living. He knew that the senses, no less the soul, have their spiritual mysteries. And so in his search to express his love for sensual pleasure, he studies perfumes, he devotes himself to music, he studies jewels and precious stones, and embroideries. And every time he comes across an interest, he kind of throws himself completely into it. And because there's no sort of nothing to stop him from spending money, because he's just got this sort of seemingly endless well of money, he just, whenever he becomes absorbed in something, he would completely indulge in everything. So when he was interested in gemstones, he would travel and buy all sorts of beautiful stones and buy all sorts of beautiful embroideries. Okay, so he really was taking Lord Henry's idea of curing the soul with the senses, literally. he always had an extraordinary faculty of becoming absolutely absorbed for the moment in whatever he took up. He was almost saddened by the reflection of the ruin that time brought on beautiful and wonderful things. He, at any rate, had escaped that. So even when he's looking at beautiful things, in the back of his mind, he's comparing them to himself and being sad that everything that's beautiful has to age and decay, and then thanking his lucky stars that he's escaped that fate. No winter marred his face or stained his flower-like bloom. Again, comparing him to a flower. So he didn't have to suffer the fate of all material things. Right, so here this extract talks about the treasures and everything he collected were to him to be a means of forgetfulness, modes by which he could escape for a season from the fear that seemed to him at times to be almost too great to be borne. Okay, so at night the previous extract talks about how he used to lie awake at night and think about or mourn the loss of his soul. And now what it addresses is this sort of heaviness that surrounds him to do with this painting. He hung with his own hands the terrible portrait whose changing features showed him the real degradation. For weeks he would not go there, would forget the hideous painted thing and get back his light heart, his wonderful joyousness, his passionate absorption. He would go away and forget all about it. Now, at the end of chapter 10, he mentioned that he need never look on it again. Obviously, he couldn't resist that temptation sometimes to gaze on it and just congratulate himself for escaping the fate that the portrait has had to bear. And other times he'd sit in front of the picture, loathing it and himself, filled at other times with pride of individualism that is half the fascination of sin, and smiling with secret pleasure at the misshapen shadow that had to bear the burden. So it wasn't always with pleasure, wasn't always with loathing. This portrait kind of had this dual role in his life depending on his mood at the time. And so after a few years, it says he could not endure to be long out of England, gave up the villa that he'd shared at Trouville with Lord Henry, as well as the little white walled-in house at Algiers, where they had more than once spent the winter. He hated to be separated from the picture. That was such a part of his life, and was also afraid that during his absences someone might gain access to the room. So at the back of his mind always is this connection that he has to the picture. Remember, that formed from the very beginning where Basil wanted to destroy it, and he said no, it would be murder. So it's almost as if the picture is actually a part of him. Although, I mean, realistically, if anybody says it's true the portrait preserved under all the foulness and ugliness, its marked likeness to himself, but what could they learn from that? So even if he told them, would they believe it? So logically he knows that the painting isn't so much dangerous to him, but he still has this fear that if somebody sees it, they might discover his truth. And this fear was something that he couldn't quite shake, so much so that he couldn't bear to be away from the painting for too long. So what we're gathering now is this picture of Dorian, who has really thrown himself into a life of hedonistic pleasures. But at the back of his mind is always this little worry of this portrait. At sometimes it brings him pleasure, sometimes it brings him pain and torture. And we'll continue with this analysis in the next video.